A $100,000 portfolio in the wrong monthly dividend ETF could cost you over $47,000 in just 10 years, compared to putting that same money in a better fund. And most people don't even realize it. I'll tell you a quick story. An investor emailed me last year. He was super excited because he found an ETF paying almost 12% per year. Every month, big, juicy dividends. But within 2 years, his capital was down 30%. The payouts kept shrinking, and he couldn't understand why the high yield wasn't making him rich. This happens all the time. Chasing yield is the #1 way income investors blow up their portfolios. But here's the good news. Today, I'm walking you through the exact 5 monthly paying ETFs I'd personally look at, the math behind why they work, and the one mistake that ruins most income strategies. And of course, this is not financial advice, just educational content to help you make smarter decisions with your own research. All right, before we jump into the best monthly paying ETFs, we need to talk about something that trips up almost every new income investor: the monthly dividend trap. On the surface, these funds look perfect. They pay you every month, the yields look huge, and it feels like passive income heaven. But here's the part most people don't realize. Many of these ETFs are quietly destroying your principal while pretending to pay you more. One of the biggest issues is something called return of capital. Instead of paying you from real profits, some funds just hand you back your own money and label it as a dividend. You feel like you're earning income, but your actual investment value is slowly melting away in the background. And this leads to the second problem: chasing yield instead of total return. I'll give you a quick example. Imagine 2 ETFs. One pays an eye-popping 11% every year. The other pays a boring 3%. Most people jump on the 11% one instantly, but over 5 years, the 3% fund can actually leave you with more money, simply because the high-yield fund's price keeps falling, while the lower-yield fund keeps growing. That's the danger. A big yield means nothing if the ETF is shrinking underneath. Now let's talk taxes, the silent killer of income strategies. Some ETFs pay qualified dividends, which get taxed at lower long-term capital gains rates. But many high-yield monthly ETFs pay ordinary dividends, which get taxed like your regular income. Depending on your tax bracket, that can be double the tax rate. I use something I call the 3 pillars framework to judge whether a monthly ETF is actually worth holding. Pillar 1 is sustainable income. Not just the yield, but whether that payout is actually supported by real income and whether it stays steady over time. Pillar 2 is the total return engine. This looks at long-term growth, dividend increases, and how stable the fund's NAV is, because an ETF that grows slowly but steadily will always beat one that pays a high yield but sinks every year. And Pillar 3 is risk-adjusted durability, basically how the ETF handles the bad times. How much did it drop? How fast did it recover? And how much risk are you taking for each % of return? If a fund fails any one of these 3 pillars, it's usually not worth holding, no matter how attractive the yield looks. Before we get to the ETFs, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe so you don't miss out. All right, let's dive into the ETFs on my list. We'll look under the hood, see how they work, what you get and what you give up. I'm not just chasing yield. I want a clean trade-off. Number 1, JEPQ. If you want a bit of tech growth plus monthly income, JEPQ is one of the more aggressive covered call ETFs out there. But with aggression comes trade-offs. JEPQ invests primarily in large-cap NASDAQ-style growth stocks, including many big tech names, but it's actively managed, not a strict NASDAQ 100 index fund. So you're talking about big tech names, growth companies. As of recent data, its top 10 holdings together make up to about 47% of the fund. That's concentration risk. When you have that much exposure to a handful of companies, a slump in tech or a miss by one of those companies can hit you hard. To generate income, JEPQ uses a covered call overlay. Instead of selling calls directly on every stock, they usually do it through equity-linked notes. But the idea is the same. They're collecting option premiums. Those premiums get paid out to investors each month, which is why JEPQ's trailing 12-month yield is sitting around 11% right now. But here's the trade-off. If the stock prices rally sharply, say one of those big tech names surges, that upside gets capped. Because you sold the call, you give up the extra gains in exchange for steady income. Compared with its cousin ETF, JEPI, which uses a more conservative, diversified S&P 500-based portfolio, JEPQ is more aggressive. More tech, more growth potential, but also more volatility and concentration risk. Use JEPQ if you have a higher risk tolerance, a longer time horizon, and want growth plus income. What's the worst-case scenario? If those tech giants all stumble, or if the sector suffers a bear market, you may get your income, but capital losses from price drops may overwhelm the premiums. That's why I'd suggest only a portion of a portfolio go here. For example, for someone aged 30 to 45, maybe 10 to 20%. For someone 45 to 60 wanting some growth in income, maybe 5 to 15%. But don't make this your core holding. Now let's look at SPYI. This one tries a different balance. It aims for high monthly income while still giving broad exposure to the entire S&P 500 stock universe and not just tech. It holds the components of the S&P 500 and uses a call option strategy on the S&P 500 index, not just individual stocks. Those option premiums plus regular dividends are paid out monthly, which is how SPYI ends up with roughly an 11 to 12% annual yield. However, and this is crucial, that 12% yield isn't guaranteed forever. Because a big part of it comes from option premiums, the yield depends heavily on market volatility and how often the fund writes or rolls options. Also, there is an opportunity cost. Because of the calls, if the S&P 500 rallies hard, SPYI's upside will be capped compared with simply holding a traditional S&P 500 ETF without covered calls. It also means you cannot treat SPYI as a pure growth plus dividend fund with unlimited upside. It's a trade-off: high income today, but potentially less long-term growth when markets boom. Given that trade-off, SPYI might make sense for someone seeking a high monthly cash flow. Maybe retirees, or those relying on income, or someone wanting to lighten risk but still hold equities. Next up is one of my favorite long-term income builders, DGRW. This one isn't about the highest yield today. It's about building a snowball, slow, steady, and extremely hard to stop once it gets going. What makes DGRW different is its focus on dividend growth, not just dividend amount. Over the last decade, many of its holdings have been raising their dividends by mid-single digits to even double-digit percentages each year. So instead of paying you a huge yield up front, this ETF keeps giving you a raise every year. And when you reinvest those dividends, even just passively through a simple drip, that's where the magic happens. If you take the historical growth rates and plug them into a compounding calculator, $10,000 invested into DGRW can grow into a surprisingly large number over 15 years. Not because the yield is massive, but because the companies inside it keep growing and paying more over time. Now, people always ask, how does DGRW compare to SCHD or VIG? Think of it like this: SCHD, the high-yield dividend machine; VIG, the steady defensive dividend pick; DGRW, the middle option, more growth than SCHD, more aggressive than VIG. For most long-term investors, DGRW can easily be 10 to 25% of a diversified portfolio. You're not using this to get rich in 12 months. You're using this to get richer every single year for the next 2 decades. 4. YXLD. This is not for growth at all. If growth is the car, YXLD is the parking brake. It pays high income, but your share price is not going to go up in the long run. In fact, if you look at the NAV, the actual value of the fund, it has been slowly declining over the last 3 to 5 years. Not because the managers are bad, but because covered call strategies trade future upside for income today. When the market climbs, YXLD doesn't fully participate, so over time it lags behind. But here's where YXLD shines. For a retiree with a larger portfolio, say $300,000, $500,000 or more, YXLD can function like a reliable monthly paycheck. You're deliberately choosing to sacrifice growth because you're prioritizing consistent income. Now, if you're younger, you can pair it with something slow and steady like VU, QQM, VUG, or even SCHD. That way, the growth side keeps your net worth rising, while YXLD provides cash flow. Most people don't get how covered calls limit gains. When the market jumps up and down, YXLD keeps selling calls, so it never fully bounces back like the index does. And finally, taxes. Most of YXLD's monthly payout is taxed as ordinary income, not the lower qualified dividend tax rate. So the summary is simple. YXLD is an income tool, not a wealth building tool. Perfect for retirees, useful in moderation for younger investors, but don't expect it to make you rich. And finally, let's talk about Divo, one of the most underrated monthly ETFs out there. Divo is what I call a grown-up dividend ETF. It focuses on quality, companies with long dividend histories, strong cash flow, and management teams that don't panic in recessions. One of the biggest strengths of Divo is how it handled bad years like 2022. When the S&P 500 was getting punched in the face, Divo held up noticeably better. Its drawdowns were smaller, and its recoveries were faster. That's the power of quality plus selective covered calls. You get downside protection without destroying the long-term growth engine. Now, yes, Divo does have a higher expense ratio than SCHD or VIG, but you're paying for active management, real stock selection, real risk management, real oversight. And honestly, for what it delivers, that fee is more than fair. Another thing people overlook is that Divo is quietly rebalancing for you. If a stock gets overvalued, they trim it. If something high quality becomes cheap, they add more. Most people never rebalance their portfolios. Divo does it for you automatically. And that's why Divo works beautifully as a core position. For the average long-term investor, I think something like 10 to 20% of a portfolio in Divo is a very comfortable level. Enough stability to smooth the ride, but still enough growth to keep your wealth compounding.